research skills, I feel like, have also evolved over the last really 5 to 8 years. It feels to me, anyhow, in my background, kind of my start was in research. It feels like more and more designers coming out of school or coming out of programs have that base in user research and kind of handle a little bit more of that, be it generative research or be it validation research, right? Whereas previously it was almost like researcher, interaction designer, UI designer were three different roles. I think you're seeing a lot more convergence of that. And I think that's great because it frees up researchers' time to really work on some of those higher value things.
Welcome to UX Ignite, fireside chat with industry leaders. Uncover user experience knowledge with your host, Kuldeep Kelkar, your partner for all things user research.
Today, we have a special guest, Rob Williams, AVP of User Experience at Sun Life up in Canada. Welcome, Rob.
Thanks, Kuldeep. Great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. You and I have spoken here and there over the last few years, and so welcome. Welcome to this special podcast episode. So let's talk a little bit about your background, how you got started in the world of user experience, what you currently do, just a high-level overview to get us started.
That I can certainly do. So I guess if we want to go all the way back to the beginning and then get to where we are right now, I guess got our first personal computer like back in the 90s, right? So I was like one of these kids who was there building bulletin board systems with my friends, like sharing Space Quest files back and forth and doing that sort of thing. And I guess kind of coming out of high school, there really weren't any, interface, experience design programs. People didn't even really know what that was, right? It was something that coders did, was you coding in Pascal, build an application, away you go with it, right? So very different time. But so I actually did a degree in broadcasting coming out of high school just because I didn't know what else to do. And when I was graduating, eventually, I was lucky because this little company called Research in Motion, which eventually became BlackBerry, was really hiring a ton of talent from across Canada. So I'm actually from Western Canada in Calgary. Right now, like, obviously, BlackBerry is in Ontario. So wound up coming over there and was able to catch on working in R&D. So running beta programs, like beta testing programs, really on consumer software. So stuff like Facebook, BlackBerry Messenger, Twitter, all those sorts of things. So luckily, kind of when I got in there, got the chance to work with some really great user researchers and designers back in the day, right? Who kind of brought me into this discipline. And being in beta, what would happen is they go through design cycles, right? And kind of evaluate interfaces, and they have a whole bunch of features, right? That they would want product managers to bring into the product. PMs would again kind of strike these things from the list, or they say out of scope. You laugh because you've heard this story before.
Yeah.
And then the researchers and designers would show up and say, hey, Rob, you're running a beta program with 500 users. Why don't you check on these features? Why don't you check and see if users might be interested in these sorts of things? So we kind of take that backlog of experience features and really try and validate whether users would be interested in those, right? So as part of that, got exposed to UX research, UX design, had a really great mentor back in the day who encouraged me to really pursue, right? Again, formal training. So, did my certified usability analyst certification way back when in Seattle through Human Factors International, and kind of kept going from there. So did a master's in communication design where I really focused on really online engagement communities, right? So if you think back to like early ideation programs and consoles, so stuff like Dell Idea Store, My Starbucks Idea, like all these new emerging online platforms, right? That we're having kind of initiating conversations between organizations and users. And so did my master's really looking at the language and like the engagement techniques that were used. And as part of that, it was really great, got to build a site called BlackBerry Beta Zone that actually did that for BlackBerry, right? So again, had the opportunity to build the interface. We deploy software to like big companies like Coke and Disney, or consumer betas, right? We launched huge betas on stuff like Twitter, Facebook, all those sorts of things where you have 100,000, 200,000 users using the software. So again, a lot of fun. That's kind of how I got into this. I won't kind of bore you with the details in terms of how I got to where I got to now, unless you want me to loop back. But I guess just to say, about 10 years later, wound up here at Sun Life, was recruited in, and started out as director of user experience, but then eventually was appointed head of user experience for Sun Life Canada. So I oversee a team of about 70 designers, researchers, writers, as well as a design operations function, and we support all of UX design for Sun Life Canada.
Nice, nice. So tell us a little bit about Sun Life, since many of the listeners in Europe or here in the US might not have encountered Sun Life as a financial institution. So tell us a little bit about Sun Life.
Absolutely. So Sun Life is one of the largest, again, insurance and financial services companies in the world. We are headquartered in Canada. That's where we do the bulk of our business, but we do have rather, again, large presence in the United States, especially on the East Coast, as well as all over Asia. So in about 20 different Asian markets. And we provide, kind of cross portfolio financial planning, insurance products, investment products, all those sorts of things. And I think there's about 120,000 Sun Life employees globally, worldwide. Many of those are actually advisors, so individuals that are selling insurance and wealth products directly to clients.
Yeah, I mean, wow. So pretty large financial organization and a pretty decent size, fairly large user experience professionals that I assume are geographically distributed as well. Yeah.
They are, yeah. So the bulk of our team is in Canada. Like I said, there's about 70 of us on the UX side up here,
Yeah.
plus a good 20-25 CX, so service designers also here in Canada. A bit smaller footprint from a design perspective. So I believe there's about 20 of us down in the US. That number kind of fluctuates based upon the contractors we have working at any given point in time. And then a really kind of sporadic distribution of experienced design professionals over in Asia as well. And oftentimes those are kind of assigned specific geographies and specific teams. So not necessarily one massive practice, more so a constellation of practitioners across a number of different regions in Asia.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I mean, I have a range of questions and we can deep dive into a variety of different topics, but the buzzword certainly in the last 12, 15 months or so has been AI, generative AI to be specific, or AI ML. And every designer, every researcher, everyone that works within the UX profession, I mean, pretty much everyone in the white collar profession is trying to figure out what does this mean? What does this mean for them? What does this mean for their companies? Uh, what does the efficiency gain mean for you as an individual as well as the company? Any high level thoughts around AI and how you see it?
So I guess I'll start just by saying this is a hot topic, as you mentioned, for us for sure, right? Because we got a large practice of designers, all of whom have their own kind of specific ideas about what we might be able to do, right? And I think depending on who you ask, you're going to get, 20 different answers. I'll just say my team actually gave a conference presentation a couple of weeks ago, and the title was Embracing Obsolescence. And that was really meant to be, right? How do you embrace
Yeah.
the tools and what's the mindset you need to really excel today, knowing that innovation is kind of exponentially increasing. It's wild. The things these LLMs can do, crazy, right? If you thought back even 5 years, if you thought you'd be here now, again, I don't think anybody saw this coming. And it's a bit dramatic, but I think the message, and I know a number of your other guests have touched on this, really practitioners have to evolve. If you're an XD practitioner, you need to embrace AI. There really isn't going to be a plan B, right? Like this
Mhm.
is the future. This is the way things are going. And I think that can be a bit scary, right? We don't have that much agency in it. Many of us aren't actually working close to it and kind of shaping it. But I think once you start playing around with it a little bit, you realize, right, it can't necessarily replace design professionals, right? It is still relatively limited in terms of the problems it can solve. However, like the opportunities for efficiency are equally exponential in terms of what it can do and sort of how it can, again, make you really a better designer by freeing up some of that headspace, right? To
Yeah.
focus on some of those higher order problems. So again, I'm not sure who said it, but somebody said the best way to kind of get started with AI is just to pick a very specific problem and try and solve for that. And I think that's actually a really, really good place to jump as opposed to trying to learn prompting, learn prompt engineering, learn all the tools, right? Learn OpenAI Studio. Like there's a lot out there. And I feel like the best way to do that is just to kind of jump in and figure
Yeah.
out what is that one use case and then kind of immerse yourself in that and you'll naturally pick up some of those tools and skills as you go along. But again, kind of the scary thing is like taking that jump and actually starting to work with it.
Mhm. Agreed, agreed. I mean, have you, Rob, heard from any designers or researchers or or anyone using AI for any specific use case, as you mentioned, and even anecdotally seeing or hearing about productivity gains, or what were lessons learned. If you have heard any stories from the field that you can share, would love to hear some of those.
Absolutely. And I think I can go two different directions with this. The first one, I'll just kind of talk a little bit about some of the tools that I'm seeing people use and some of the things I'm hearing, to your point, anecdotally. Like, I ran my all hands just last week, and my message to people basically was, whatever's out there, whatever you're interested, go explore it, learn with it, work with it, and bring those learnings back, right?
Yeah.
Because I think there's far too many tools, and there's far, again, too many opportunities for any one person to ever kind of encapsulate, and they just grow, right? Day by day by day, you're hearing about something new. But I guess in terms of practical things that we've done, even just lately, right? Something like content or research synthesis can be,
Mm.
again, accelerated like to the nth degree. I mean, I'll take the example. We have a team internally who ran a workshop for about 30 people, and it was about 3 days of the session. Naturally, you're going to generate a ton of stickies, a ton of insights, right? It got literally hundreds, thousands, right, of these individual kind of stickies sitting around in a board. It took them a week to go through and synthesize all that information. Now, if you got access to Jambot, right, which is, again, Figma's, again, AI Copilot for FigJam, you can actually automate some of that synthesis. So we took it and we took that board after the fact and said, you know what, how long would this actually take if we just use Jambot to synthesize it? And literally, 2 minutes later, right, I've got now a list of the top 10 themes that were in here. Naturally, you got to go back and do some QC on that and understand what's
Yeah.
in it. But like, that's crazy. Like, going from 1 week down to, a couple of minutes plus some initial analysis time. So call it a week to an hour, a week to a day for something like that is just out of this world. And I mean, I can give you a couple more examples, but it's like stuff like that is what we're looking at, just trying to bring some of those tools we already have access to and see how we can accelerate things.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I mean, the entire I have personally tried this with transcripts. I have personally tried this with meeting recordings, right? And boy, there is no way a human can read through 10 session transcripts and come up with highlights just based on the transcripts. And so what these generative AI tools can do is just magic in some instances. But back to your point, somebody still has to ask the right questions. Somebody still has to take it and then figure out what does that mean. And sometimes you have to even correct it because it might not know the context to the right degree. So agreed. Yeah. Lovely. So really great to hear that designers, researchers, everyone within the organization, through your leadership, you're already embracing AI because, as you said, doesn't look like there is a plan B. It's much better to continue on this plan A. So shifting gears a little bit, and Rob, you have been in the industry for a while, and you have seen user experience profession evolve over the last 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. So what do you think are the overall strengths and areas of opportunity to learn in general for UX professionals? So let's start with strengths, right? What are UXers in general, designers, researchers good at?
So I'll say over the last 10 years, the biggest thing that I have noticed, and again, my position, head of UX design. So the bulk of the people on my team are designers in some way, shape, or form, be they UX designers, be they content designers. I really feel UI skills have improved by leaps and bounds over the last decade and really over the last 5 years. And I think a lot of that has to do with, the growth and infusion of design systems, right? So we're kind of taking away a lot of that complexity from designers who no longer have to go kind of full stack design to get to those high fidelity designs. But I think also, I mean, the tooling is getting better, right? Figma kind of step change over Sketch was a step change over Axure, right? And on and on and on. You can go back, right? But again, they've just simplified a lot of the UI-based elements of that tool to such a degree that it's way easier versus like jumping in and seeing the kitchen sink in Photoshop or something like that and just being like blown away, right? Where you
Yeah.
literally need a degree to work in Illustrator. So I think there's a lot of kind of development in that area, and Gen AI obviously is just going to exponentially increase that, right? Wherein now we can generate images, we can generate layouts very quickly, and they can go high fidelity if we need to right out of the gate. So I feel like those UI skills certainly have evolved, and it's almost, again, become sort of table stakes. I think another thing that's interesting, real-time collaboration and how that's grown, right? When I go back, like the example I used in the beginning where I'm talking about, oh, a researcher would give me a list of 20 things, right? And then we go and see if we could actually get some of those in and people using them. Like today, in terms of real-time collaboration, it would literally take a designer, like maybe an hour working in concert with a product manager to put all those ideas into an actual interface and actually kind of to collaborate on the fly, right? So no more of this waterfall handoff. Okay, you give me requirements, I go away, I'll come back with something. Is this what you wanted? No, okay. Like you're seeing a lot faster and cleaner collaboration between teams because you are using some of these synchronous tools, which is awesome. And I think we've gotten to a point as designers where I often see some of my really talented people, they're able to actually grip concepts on the fly and do that faster than a product manager can actually come up with something that they want to see or would be interested in. And I think that's so different than it would have been like, 10 years ago. I think the last thing I'll mention in terms of what's actually improved, research skills, I feel like have also evolved over the last really 5 to 8 years. It feels to me, anyhow, in my background, kind of my start was in research. It feels like more and more designers coming out of school or coming out of programs have that base in user research and kind of handle a little bit more of that, be it generative research or be it validation research, right? Whereas previously it was almost like researcher, interaction designer, UI designer were three different roles. I think you're seeing a lot more convergence of that. And I think that's great because it frees up researchers' time to really work on some of those higher value things.
Yeah. Oh, so I was listing down all three, and when you mentioned collaboration, this takes me back 10, maybe 15 years ago, where just simple version control or where is the latest file, where the content is in this version, but the design is in that version and the visual design. Oh, yeah, yeah. So many inefficiencies back in the day. I think designers today would not even know how inefficient these things were. And to be honest, it didn't feel inefficient back then because those were the tools of the day. So certainly the tools, the collaboration, the in the cloud distributed nature of everything from design to research to multi-threaded collaboration. So yeah, of course. Uh, So even before generative AI, you're right, we as a community have been a lot more productive just through these collaboration and better tooling. Now, generative AI is going to increase the productivity potentially even more in coming years. And so time will tell. Cool. So on the flip side of what designers and researchers are good at, what do you think are the areas of opportunity to grow in general terms at a high level?
So I guess I'll speak to this from the lens of somebody who leads a design organization who is within a bigger organization that's still kind of moving towards design maturity. So I feel like, again, some of these problems may be a little closer to someone who's a little bit lower on the maturity spectrum, but I do think there's kind of nuggets in each one of these things that kind of apply no matter where you work. But the first one I find is just when a designer comes out of a program or a university, kind of university program or a boot camp, they kind of get this indoctrinated into the process, right? And here is the design process, and these are the 5 steps that thou shalt follow. And if you don't do them in this order, if you don't do this proper research, you're never going to get to a good outcome. And I think what that kind of teaches people is that there's a zero-sum approach to design, right? Either my design or my idea gets implemented or I lost, right? And I don't really think, if you think about product development, digital product development, it doesn't really work that way, right? Kind of the core is solving problems collaboratively and knowing that there's always going to be trade-offs as you move along that process, right? And I think it's more about principles than it is about process. So principles to guide how we might interact, not a rigid process. And I'll tell you, when I started at a previous job, a designer came to me and handed me a 20-step process that governed how they interacted with their product team. And it was gated and steps and all the way through. And I'm going, wow, all right. If this is the approach and you need a document to govern how you're going to collaborate with someone, I think you've already lost, first and foremost. And secondly, you kind of got to think about how you're showing up as teammates, right? So no matter what you're doing, there's always going to be some of that give and take. But I think that comes back to knowing the ideal process, but also knowing when it's okay to diverge and what the best way is to work with teams. So I feel like we've got some work to do there as a practice to kind of help shape that and kind of show up every day with that mindset. Something I think we're going to talk about later is this idea of understanding and positioning work through the lens of business outcomes, right? I'll tell you, I got a pet peeve whenever a designer shows up and says the business asked for this feature, the business asked for, this design, right? Because like you got to think about it. If you're a designer and you work for an organization, you are part of the business. The business pays you, right? The business's goals, in theory, should be your goals to a large extent. It's not
Yeah.
this amorphous business that's making you do things. We're
Yeah.
trying to do it together. And I feel like, again, there's some work to be done still, right, to get people to see that. But ultimately, it kind of comes back to collaboration again, right? How do we work together to understand the business objectives that this feature or this initiative is trying to achieve, and then figure out how user experience and design can be positioned to help achieve those goals? Like, that's really where we need to start from, because if you come and say, the business told me to do
Yeah.
this, like I can already tell you what type of relationship you have with your product team or your start partners and stakeholders, and it's a very transactional one. So I think there's still
Yeah,
room.
well said. I mean, completely agreed with both. And so I have a related question to the both the process as well as the influence. Um, in my mentorship sessions, I hear a lot from people who are either starting out within the industry or have been doing this for the last 5 to 10 years, to want to figure out a way to influence their organization more. Um, I think there are so many designers and researchers with so much know-how and talent and the process and the know-how, yet are not able to craft their story or demonstrate their story and be able to rise within the organization or influence influence product managers, business stakeholders. Could be marketing, it could be engineering, it could be everyone. So there are so many of us, UX community in general, who want better influence but have not yet figured out how to do that. Um, A, do you agree? And B, do you have recommendations on how to do this?
Absolutely. I 100% agree, right? That this is a challenge, this is a struggle, and it's especially hard earlier in your career when perhaps you don't have that span of experience that, you've seen a few projects through end to end. You kind of understand, have some success stories to point back to, right? So, I mean, part of it's experience, but then to your point, part of it's also positioning, right? So, you got to think most organizations, financial services for sure, you've got executives and P&L, so profit and loss leaders, who are really the ones who make the decisions. And I don't think, again, I could be wrong, but I don't think they roll out of bed in the morning going, I can't wait to see how we're going to increase dividends for our shareholders by screwing over experience or cutting corners, right? Like, I don't think anybody gets up thinking that. But I also think we sometimes don't do a good job of doing that translation from experience, right? The value of a better experience to those objectives, to again, increasing conversion, reducing abandonment, reducing calls, all those types of things, right? So for me, kind of the starting point whenever I was designing something as an individual contributor and even over through my career, it was always about lining up with the product manager and understanding how they're being evaluated. What are those metrics, right? What are the KPIs you're looking at? Taking a step back, thinking, well, okay, this particular feature, say a new product enrollment, for example, well, how is increased conversion or moving people further down this funnel going to help get us towards that goal? And then trying to work together to put a bit of a value on that to say, if we increase, click-throughs at this particular step by 20%, what does that do, right? To the number of individuals who make it to the end of this flow. And what is the value of that? And trying to work backwards from there. But I feel like you kind of got to start with what the business objective or goal is going to be, and then come away with that by saying, all right, how do I support that? How do I support this individual or this team in achieving that objective? And I guess I'll just say, shameless plug for Sun Life, we did start a leadership development program a couple of years ago, and the entire
Yeah.
last third of the program is this, right? It's crafting a capstone case study, it's talking about the value of design, and it's speaking back to the business in business terms that they will then understand. And we actually have them present to senior leaders, right, executives, decision makers, to get feedback on that, to try and refine their thinking, because you're only going to have to keep doing more and more of that as you move on down your career if you're taking on bigger and bigger projects, which have larger and larger financial implications.
That is such a fantastic story to hear, Rob, where it's not just enough to say, hey, we should be talking the business language. We should be measuring conversion and business. I think people understand the theory. The struggle sometimes is the how and how do I. So you guys have an established training program for emerging leaders, and you get them to execute on those and present some real data, which is the practices in the execution. I guess it's not theoretical anymore. You encourage them to execute on it. That's so wonderful.
Well, I mean, Kuldeep, it's hard to like ask someone to do that without giving them kind of, a template or a process to follow so they understand what's needed and then practicing it, right? I was just having this conversation last week with someone who come through the program, and I'm like, it's great that you had an awesome talk track coming into that conversation with those executives, right? Did you actually get to go through that talk track? No. Not at all, right? I got like the first 3 minutes in, and then questions came, and then the questions led to other questions. And it's like, it's not about formulating a narrative as much as it is understanding the business implications and message you want to deliver and being really solid about that and being able to kind of flex depending on where that conversation goes, right? And I think
Nice,
that being able to think on your
nice,
feet, that's a skill
nice.
unto its own. I will say
That's
though,
clearly a sign of higher maturity, a higher
yeah.
UX maturity within Sun Life. So kudos to you, Rob, and the entire Sun Life organization. So somewhat related, since you have a larger organization, and you touched a little bit on design system, right, or essentially ways of scaling designers throughput or productivity, as well as potentially researchers. So talk to me a little bit, without getting into the specific details of how this design system was established, but what it is, how it was established, how does it get used, any stories from the wild for the listeners around design systems and ability to scale.
So, I mean, there's a lot of places we can go with this because we're coming to the end of the initial portion of this journey. And I will say there were a few false starts for us in terms of building a design system at Sun Life, which was terrifying because I won't even tell you how many different flavors of navigation and layouts within some of our secure websites and applications and that sort of thing. But I think really the way we sold it back to the organization really was around efficiency and economies of scale, right? So for us, in terms of getting funding to build that design system, we had to come back and effectively say, hey, we're going through this digital transformation. Digital transformation is going to bring engineers, it's going to bring designers, it's going to bring QA people. We need to make sure we're working from a consistent set of front end patterns. Otherwise, these people are just going to be duplicating effort over and over again. And we actually took, again, external data. So again, some from consulting firms, some from other organizations, some from pilots we had run, just to put numbers around that. And I think we had said, design system is going to make designers about 75% more efficient when they're working on common patterns, because I can just pull something off the shelf. Front-end developers, I think the number is about 25%, right? If I'm doing a common component, okay, great. Here's my date picker. Okay, great. Here's my button. That sort of idea. And by doing that modeling, we then essentially extended it out across all the teams at Sun Life and said, you know what, as we move along this adoption curve, this is how many hours are going to be saved. This is, how this looks, right? When you tracking those hours as actually hourly wages for individuals. So the financial side of it got really good, and we were able to work with our finance team to really put a compelling business case together that we've delivered on. I think the designer experience piece of it, for me anyhow, is more important, right? Because again, a lot of the time, what our designers would be doing half their day, right? If they're assigned to a new feature before they got this design system, they're out there looking for patterns, right? What is the latest pattern for this table? What's the latest pattern for this type of landing page? And they come back with 5 examples. And then the question was, which one's the right one? Well, that generates 5 meetings to talk about those things to say which is the right pattern and what's the right way to go. So what we've seen now, they got this common design system. It is so much faster. Like that 75% may actually be low in terms of how quickly we can turn around something that's common and consistent across the board, right? Which is awesome. I think it also helps when you start looking at the research side of things, because now we're not necessarily worried when we go through a validation study talking about, this interface is totally different than this interface, right? And admit that maybe that's why these two things don't perform well, and actually get down to the next level to say, you know what? When I've removed that layer of inconsistency from the UI layer, I can focus on what actually matters, right? So things like choice architecture, things like content structure and content hierarchy, right? Things like the emotional side of it. Are we doing a good job of making you feel supported, making you feel trusted, right? So it's interesting to say, you know what, you would think the design system would only help people who are actively building things, when actually on the research side, it actually helps us too, because now we're doing higher order research as we go through this, right?
Yeah, I mean, well said. And I've spoken to a lot of people who have been involved with some successful implementations of design system, and some that fizzled out or really didn't work through, and they had to go through a second iteration. And uh, at least the successful ones have been working with the UI development teams as well. I see you are already shaking your head.
Oh,
So,
yes.
any stories about collaboration with the engineering counterparts, with the UI developers in specific?
Well, I think the short answer is it really goes nowhere if your front end developers don't want to use it, right? They're effectively the engine that drives adoption within many of your product development teams, right? So if you don't have, good documentation, again, solid kind of testing done on all these components, making sure that they're easy to access from the repo, like all these things around developer enablement, it's not going to go very far. So for us, when we were putting this together, there was a real focus on making this easy to use for our developers. Like they are a key core audience, partner, stakeholder, choose your term, in this whole process. And what we had actually done when we had minted really what we call V1 of our design system last summer, we held a cross domain, we call them domains here in terms of engineering, QA, design, et cetera. We held this cross domain symposium and brought all of our front end developers in Canada into Toronto for the day, had a lunch. It was them and the design team, and kind of walked through end to end. This is our design system. This is how it works. This is where the assets are. And then just did an open Q&A for, about an hour afterwards. It went much longer than we thought it would because there are so many good questions. But what really came out of that, a lot of thank you. Oh, thank you so much. I was so tired because like on the design side, when I was mentioning, oh, I got to go look at 5 different applications and pull these layouts and figure out what's the right one. It's the exact same thing if you're a front end developer trying to say, well, what's the right implementation of this pattern, this component? Is it this one? Is it this one? Is it this one? They're all slightly different. And as we know, like that's how technical debt gets proliferated, right?
Mm,
When someone
mm,
copies code that's not, again, the kind of shining example, and then they paste it into another application, and then someone
yeah.
else takes that one, pastes it elsewhere. So I think they really gravitated towards that standardization. And I think what we've seen now, which is fascinating, we actually just put some instrumentation in place to say, hey, where are all the insertions for the design system across the organization? We built 7 teams we hadn't heard of who picked it up and started putting it in their apps without us even having to talk to them or enable them, because they've heard, they see the tools, and they've just adopted it, which is awesome. Like that's how you get that organic growth.
Okay, clearly that's, I guess, when you have not marketed, not sold, and somebody took it and implemented, I guess that says a lot about the value. And there's a carrot and the stick. This is clearly a story of the carrot.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, you
Cool.
got to have those good partnerships, no question.
Yeah. Cool. Rob, switching gears a little bit. In my mentorship sessions, I spent some time with emerging leaders, and you spoke a little bit about the emerging leadership program. Or there's a lot in the UX community in general, people who are within their 5, 10, 15 years of career, who are trying to figure out, hey, what do I do next? What do I do over the next 3 years? What do I do over the next 5 years? For the sake of our conversation, I'll choose to disregard all the layoff news that was happening within the last year, because the reality is that there are still hundreds of thousands of people that are working within the UX domain. and who are trying to figure out what does their career path look like? What does what what does future leadership look like? Do I want to be continue to be an individual contributor and grow in the principal and because that's what I enjoy? Or do I want to be in this people leadership? And if that doesn't work, what do I do? So I know you have seen a lot of leaders, you have helped groom a lot of leaders. You yourself have been a leader for a while. Your thoughts in general, and then I have a couple of specific questions.
Sure. So, I mean, a manager, a mentor of mine actually put it to me really well. And he effectively said, you know what? There's like three spheres of life. There's your home life, there's your work life, and there's your health, generally overall. And it's really hard to get all those things in balance on any given day, right? Even when you are an individual contributor. So if you're going to move into a leadership position, you've now basically brought a whole bunch of other variables into that work life. And I think before you even entertain going into leadership, you gotta take a minute and acknowledge that, right? That there's now a whole lot more things that can happen over the course of the day because other people are looking to you to help them kind of sort out challenges, figure out what opportunities they should go for, kind of mitigate interpersonal conflict. So really what it equates to is a lot more opportunity for disruption and imbalance in your day because people are complicated, right? So I think before anybody considers leadership, that is the first thing to think about, cognizant of where you are in your life and whether that's something you actually think that you can take on. And that can be, an interesting kind of point of reflection for people. What we try and do is kind of create a position where people can balance, right? So for their first role, right, we move them into something called UX lead or design lead, which is really focused 50-50, right? Half your time's on the craft, half your time's on people. And I feel like good organizations usually have something like this in place, right? So people can get into that role, kind of manage people, but also manage the work, and then see which way they lean, right? And if you're somebody who seems to keep wanting to go into the details or keep wanting to jump into the design side and goes, okay, this person keep coming with these problems, I don't want to listen to it. Okay, probably a pretty good indicator that leadership's not the best kind of long term for you, or at least not at the time. Conversely, if you find yourself spending lots of time coaching, mentoring, helping people, growing people, that's also a really good indicator, right? That you are going to be somebody who is probably well oriented towards leadership. So I think having that opportunity, really important. Super quick, last thing I'll say, you kind of got, if you're going to be a leader, you got to embrace that incremental progress and move away from the zero sum mentality, right? You got to be someone who's diplomatic, who understands that making progress towards a greater good or a better goal is actually sometimes really, it's really good. It's positive, right? And you got to help others understand that and kind of pull themselves out from that zero sum mentality I mentioned before and help them see, what, you are contributing to the greater good. You need to see the positive in things. And I feel like if you're somebody who maybe doesn't do that naturally, that might be a good place to start in terms of building that leadership acumen and just that more positive outlook, because that's what you're going to need to help level other people.
Yeah, wow. Lots of recommendations, and again, somewhat similar to your previous comments. So do you have it sounds like you have a structured program to give people the opportunity to try out essentially leadership or management without risking their so feet in both camps, try it out and then decide which one. Okay. And how does that work?
Honestly, it's been tremendously positive to this point, right? I mean, regardless of whether because it's about it's about a 4-month program. After you come out of the program, regardless of whether you become a people leader or not, you still learn things around conflict resolution, providing feedback, interpersonal relationships, running critiques, like all these core skills that are always going to be good, no matter whether you're, a principal or staff designer someday or a manager or a leader, right? So, I mean, those skills are universal. It's just a question of where you apply them. And then coming out the other side, we've actually found the majority of people actually do really like leadership. And I just have to wonder, right, how much of that is natural and how much of that is just setting people up for success, right? Because I'm sure you've known lots of people throughout your career who maybe been pushed into a management position before they were ready, had a bad experience, and then take 2 big steps back and never go back to it. So that was really what we wanted to do, is eliminate that type of situation from happening.
Wow, wonderful. So I know we're running out of time. Last question for you. Very insightful conversation, by the way, Rob. Any advice you would have for people who are within that 5 to 10 year career trajectory, and they're thinking about their next 5 years? What would you recommend to someone who comes to you and says, "Hey, how should I think about the next 5 years, or what should I do?" What would your recommendations be? It's an open-ended question.
So, I mean, I think we touched a lot on embracing AI and all things generative AI tool related. I think that's just, table stakes at this point. We know that's the way it's going to be. So whether you're individual contributor or manager, that to me is kind of step one. Moving into if you're at that point of inflection, trying to figure out what you want to do, I think it kind of also comes back to how you're wired and where you get your energy, right? And I think a lot of designers and design leaders are introverts. I mean, I count myself amongst that number. I'm not sure about yourself, right? Where you sort of need time
Well,
away to recharge, right? And regroup. And like that's where your energy comes from. That's where your ideas come from. And it's like there's reasons like the Bill Gateses and Jeff Bezoses of the world go off for a week and read books and think, right? Because like that's where the good ideas come from. But I feel like regardless of what you do or where you're going to go, if that's you, you need to find a way to take that time and keep that time for yourself because that's how you're going to stay energized. That's how you're going to stay recharged. And that's also kind of how you're going to bring your best self no matter what you're doing. And I always recommend the book Deep Work by Cal Newport. If you haven't read it, it's certainly worth the time. Just in terms of how he structures his life, because I think there's a lot to be taken from there. I also feel like, again, if you're talking about leadership, there's a really great quote that I had heard from Bob Baxley, where basically he said, when I moved into design, right, as design leadership, it took me a while to realize I was still a designer. I'm just designing organizations and structures as opposed to interactions, right? So the thing that designs the things. And I think that can be every bit as rewarding as designing an awesome interface or an awesome application, but it requires a change in your framing and some of the frame of mind and how you approach things. And it took me a while, certainly, to kind of rationalize and come to terms with that. But I feel like, again, if you think you want to move into leadership, there are still applications of kind of that critical thinking, that design thinking, and that structure, kind of that systems thinking that you can bring with you every day. So again, if you're thinking about moving into leadership and you're not sure if it's for you because you're going to have to let go of that stuff, you don't actually need to. It just slightly changes, right, in terms of what you're asked to do day to day.
yeah. So yeah, I was jotting down. There's so many recommendations here. So thank you, Rob. I mean, it clearly sounds like you're a great mentor, and congratulations again on building out a fabulous team. Clearly, I speak with a lot of leaders and organizations that are at various levels of maturities. Uh, Based on what I heard from you, clearly there are lots of processes, elements of higher maturity already infused within the organization. And congratulations to you, congratulations to the entire team. Thank you to all the listeners. Wonderful catching up with you, Rob. Thank you for being on the show, and I hope the listeners enjoy it as much as I did.
Love it. Thanks, Kuldeep. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
That's a wrap for UX Ignite. Keep the UX fire burning. Subscribe, share, and stay inspired. Until next time, ignite your research journey.